It's important they know the score. I'm not talking about a football score or a basketball score. I'm talking about a story score. What's the score of your story? Do you have a story? Are you telling a story? Hopefully you're telling a story. If you've done any studying or any looking at presentations and how to do presentations and speeches, one thing you hear again and again and again is the importance of telling a story. Make a point, tell a story. Probably have heard that lots of times or seen that lots of times. Examples tell, stories sell. So if you want to sell your audience, get them involved, get them interested, you need to have a story. But every story has to have a score. SCoRe is a term that was come up with Andrew Abella. And he is a professor. And he has this system that talks about the importance of getting a score, how getting a score really helps the story come along. Because a lot of stories fall down because of one of three things is missing. There are three things every good story should have. The acronym SCoRe kind of summarizes them up, what they're all about. SCoRe. So just remembering SCoRe helps you remember, oh yeah, that's what needs to be there. Now some of the things in the story are kind of obvious. The first one, fairly obvious. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't have it, everything falls apart. It just doesn't work. It doesn't connect. Have you ever seen a story or seen a speaker up there and heard them saying something and thought, I don't know why, it's just not connecting, it's not working? Then you know that the score wasn't there. For some reason or other, they didn't have that sense of score. Maybe it was the first thing wasn't there. And the first thing is essential for getting things going. But it could be the second thing wasn't there. A lot of people tell a story with just the first thing, completely forget about the second thing, and that's it. The story doesn't go anywhere. Nothing ever happens. And even if you get the first and the second thing, maybe you forget about the third thing. So while the first thing gets things started, the second thing gets things continually going, it's that third thing. It's so important to a story and so many people leave out. Now the reason there is this term SCoRe is because many people, when they're creating stories for their speeches, for their presentations, forget one or two of these things. Some stories don't have any of the three at all, and those are just boring stories. You know those stories automatically when you're sitting through a story and think, oh man, jeez, what time is it here? Are we through yet? Are we done? Oh man, I gotta sit through this? Oh, jeez. Like watching paint dry. You had presentations like that? Hey, you know what I'm talking about. Exactly. They just go on. How boring is that, right? Yeah? Exactly. Those presentations are boring. They go on and on and on. You're not quite sure where they're going. It's because they don't have SCoRe. So today you're going to find out a little bit about what SCoRe is, how it works, how important it is, in a way it can really boost you up in terms of presenting. And you'll understand afterwards about how you'll look better on stage once you start using the SCoRe method. So everything will be there. People will get a sense of, yeah, I get that presentation. That makes sense to me. I get it. I get what they're talking about. It's not such a big deal. You won't waste the audience's time. You won't waste your time. Instead of thinking, geez, is this story got everything there? Is everything's okay? You'll know, yeah, everything's fine. I got it all down, ready to go. This story is going to happen. It's going to be great. It's going to just knock them dead because everything's there. I know it's all there because I got the SCoRe. That's really important. So today you're going to find out about the SCoRe system for creating better stories. And the very first thing is the S in the SCoRe system. The S. And as mentioned, it's pretty obvious. There has to be some sort of S. Has to be something at the beginning of a story. Although maybe you've experienced stories where it's not there, and you thought, where's this thing going? What's happening? Maybe you've heard stories like that from very small kids. Small kids tell stories. They tend to leave out the S. They tend to say stories sort of like, well, the other day I saw a frog, and then the frog hopped away, and then I got some gum, and there was a candy after that, and then later on we went into... You heard these kids' stories? There's no S. You go out of your mind and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And that's because they're missing the situation. The situation. So S is for situation. It's got to be a situation. The reason many of those kids' stories are so boring and so bizarre, make you tear at your hair and think, no, not another one of those, is because there's no situation. The situation changes. There's a frog, and there's a tree, and there's some candy, and there's a sky, and there's a balloon, and it just keeps on going all over the place. What's the situation? You don't know. But the situation is powerful. Once you have a situation, then and only then something can happen. Imagine a situation comedy, or as they're more often called, sitcoms, without a situation. You thought about that? Situation comedies do start with a situation, right? I mean, think about it. Some comedies like, if you've ever seen The Big Bang Theory, there's a situation, there's setup, there's something you have to understand at the beginning. There are these nerdy guys, and they all kind of hang around together. That's the situation. There's a beautiful girl across the hall. That's another part of the situation. This whole thing's based on a bunch of nerdy guys, beautiful girl across the hall. That's the situation. If that situation wasn't there, you just had a bunch of guys kind of showing up here and there, and a beautiful girl would come on every now and then and be like, what's going on? What's happening? Because there wouldn't be any situation. And you might be thinking, Tim, this is obvious. Of course your story has to have a situation. I mean, all stories have situations. Well, unfortunately, no, they don't. And there are speakers that start out their story not any idea about even what's really going on. They just kind of wander. It's those I just got up this morning stories. Well, I got up this morning, and then I went outside. It was a beautiful day. Went walking around. It's gorgeous. Went back to bed. Then I got up the next day. It's a beautiful day. There's no situation. It's just kind of this random event going on. There's nothing really happening that can make things interesting. Because if you've got the right situation, then you're setting up for the C, the SCoRe system. I'm going to get to what the C is in a little bit. But it all begins with understanding that situation. Right at the very beginning. Aha! Got a situation, you know something's going to happen. You got a bunch of nerdy guys who hang around together, and they're all kind of cliquish, and they only do things together. There's this beautiful girl across the hall. That's a situation. All of a sudden you're thinking, okay, all right, I get it. All right, there's something you can go with that. I see where something can happen. The situation sets things up so something can happen in your story. But it doesn't need to be that elaborate. It certainly doesn't need to be a comedy. Situation could simply be that I've been working in my job for the last 10 years. I really enjoy it a lot. It's a great job. It's fantastic. I'm good at it, and I've risen very high in the company. That could be the situation. That gives a place of where the story starts at. That situation, where that story starts at. And then people say, okay, I get it. That's where we are. And then, later on, will come that C, and talk about in just a little bit. So to know the SCoRe, the first thing to know about is the situation. Once you get to the C in the SCoRe system, or more properly the CO, you start to do something in that situation. Because if you just had a situation, any situation, like here are a bunch of guys, here's a beautiful girl across the hall, great, and then everything would just kind of go like this. They kind of hang together, they bump into the girl every now and then in the hall, they say hi, maybe they happen to be in the laundry room and they see her at the same time, fine, no big deal. That's the situation. But you need to have that C, or CO, as I mentioned in the SCoRe system. Need to have that C. Because that's going to make things happen. And many, many people have got a great situation set up in their stories. And then they forget about the C and their stories are just like this. Just like that. All the way across. And you're thinking, okay, I get it, but nothing's happening. Why is nothing happening? And that's because those stories don't have complication. Complication. Really important to have that C, or that CO, for complication. Because a complication gets everything going. Gets your audience thinking, oh, okay, yeah, I want to see what happens next here. So you got these nerdy guys hanging around together. You got this beautiful girl, and one guy decides he wants to talk to that girl across the hall. Well, all of a sudden, that's a complication. For one thing, he's got to step way out of his comfort zone and talk to a pretty girl, which is not something he normally does. For another thing, he has to step out of his friends, away from his friends. So his friends may feel like he's abandoning them. And the girl may feel like she's really not that keen on having him around. It's a complication. It's something going differently. So everything's like this, and all of a sudden, boop, complication happens, and then the tension starts to rise. And the tension starts to rise, starts to build. That happens when you've got a complication. A lot of people tell stories like that story earlier talking about getting up in the morning. Well, I got up in the morning, walked around, beautiful day, fantastic, went back to bed, got up the next day, beautiful day, walked around. There's no complication, the story's just like this. That's it, just like this. No problems, no difficulties. If you are telling a story that has no problems and no difficulty, you're telling a boring story. You ever told a boring story? You have, right? Difficult, embarrassing, right? Yeah. You ever heard a boring story? Oh, you know what I'm talking about. They go on and on and on, not going anywhere. Yeah, a boring story. And it happens when you don't have complications. So if you're going through your story, you got a nice situation set up and everything's fine, make sure something happens. That's the complication. In fact, you can think of it that way. I was walking along all of a sudden, and then something happened. Something happened. That something is the complication. And that complication will create issues, will create problems, and it keeps on going and building and building. The complication. World champion speaker Craig Valentine talks about it in terms of the movie Titanic. He says, imagine the movie Titanic if the water didn't rise. Well, if you've never seen the movie Titanic, it's about the sinking of the ship. As the ship sinks, the water rises in the boat. The water rises in the boat, people have less and less air. That drives all the action. If the boat didn't sink, if the water didn't rise, there wouldn't be any movie Titanic. It'd be just about this ship sail all the way from one place to the other, and people would just go on it and have their own kind of boring lives, and that'd be it. Complication. Remember complication. So even if you set up a beautiful situation, no complication, you got a problem. So the SCoRe system, situation, complication. That's all it is. As you get complication on complication on complication, that builds up the tension. And that's great in a story. But building up the tension isn't enough without the R. Get to that in just a little bit. For right now, remember, situation, complication, something's got to give. Something's got to give. Even if you have a situation and a complication, something's got to give. You aren't familiar with that expression. It simply means that something needs to change, something needs to be adjusted in order for something to happen here. And that happening is the R. And what happens to many speakers, many storytellers even, they get so excited about the situation and so enraptured with the complication, they forget entirely about the R. They leave it out. And the whole audience is like, okay, and then? Now, sometimes that's deliberate. Today, a lot of TV shows deliberately leave out the R because they want these shows to go from week to week to week to week to week to week to week forever, basically. So no R there. But for your audience, make sure you include the R. That's what they really want. And R is for resolution. R is for resolution. When you have a situation and things are coming along, there's complication like, oh, man, okay, things are not going well. And then people say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? In a speech, at the end of that speech, you want the audience to feel satisfied. You've got to tell them what happened. That's the resolution. If you've got a speech where here's a situation going on, and there's this complication, and you don't tell them what happened, that's a problem. It's like saying, I was at my job for 10 years. It was a great job. Then one day, they said that they're downsizing people. All of a sudden, there I was. I went every day. I didn't know whether I'd be downsized at all. Every day I was walking on eggshells, thinking I was about to be downsized. Well, the important lesson in that is that if you're going to be downsized, wait a minute here. Here's a situation where everything's fine. You're about to be downsized. What happened? Did you or did you not get downsized? What did you do after that? Resolution. That's a story that's missing resolution, and a lot of speakers do that. And I got this complication, things got really bad, and anyway, that's done. So, no! Resolution. World champion Craig Valentine calls it finishing the story. Finish the story. Quite often with new speakers, and even some experienced speakers, they'll be telling the story and going on along, and they're so anxious to get to their point, they won't finish the story. People wonder, how did it turn out? If you're telling a story, it's a romance about two star-struck lovers that are star-crossed and have difficulty getting together, then at least at the end, tell them, did they get together? Did they not get together? If they did or didn't get together, what happened after that? Did the relationship work out? Did it not work out? If it not, why? Something. Finish the story. And an easy way to tell if your story is finished is just to ask yourself, what happens next? What happens next? And when you can no longer ask what happens next, you know the story is finished. It's resolved. The resolution is there. But if you can keep on saying, what happened next? What happened next? What happened next? And your story's finished, and at the very end you're thinking, wait a minute, what happened next? That's a problem. Because your audience is thinking the same thing. They're thinking, wait a minute, okay. Here this thing came along, and this problem happened, okay. And it sort of got resolved somehow, but then what happened? You want to wrap all that up. Wrap all that up in a resolution. Now the resolution ultimately is going to be your point. The resolution is ultimately going to be the point you're trying to make. So the point is how you went to rags to riches. You're going to talk about the rags and all the problems that happened, and then you did something, and then the resolution is now it's all riches. Now I get all this money and wonderful and power and all this stuff I didn't have before because I did something, and that's what resolved everything. So you'll want your audience to take the same sort of behaviors you do. If you want to go from rags to riches, you can follow the same process. Just make sure you're telling that story from rags to riches. You tell a little bit what happened with your riches. Not everything's horrible, all these problems, now I got money. Anyway, did it help you? How did it help you? What did it do to you? Resolve that situation. Telling stories is a great way to get your point across. In fact, you may have heard this before. Make a point, tell a story. Make a point, tell a story. And tell a story to make your point. Examples: tell, stories, sell. If you've studied speaking or even read anything on speaking, you probably have seen that sort of thing. But if you want to make those stories work, if you want to make those stories really be effective, it helps to use the SCoRe system, as Andrew Abella, professor, calls it. And the SCoRe system simply has three parts. And the first thing is S, the situation. Every story has to begin somewhere. The story begins with a situation. And the situation simply says, what's going on at the time? If you're telling a story and the audience has no clue what's going on, they're not going to get very far with that story. And while little kids can tell stories where you don't know what the heck's going on, that's why they're bad stories. Don't tell little kid stories. Make a very clear situation. So the audience knows, aha, that's what's going on. Doesn't have to be a lot of words. Could just be, I'd been in my job for 10 years, I loved it, I was getting steadily promoted, everything was going well. That's a situation. That's a situation. That's what's going on. Then remember the C, or the CO. S in SCoRe, situation. CO in SCoRe, complication. Complication. Because if everything's fine and wonderful and great and terrific, you got a boring story. There has to be a complication. Something has to go wrong. If all of a sudden, hey, I was just getting promoted and promoted, my life is wonderful and great, and nothing ever happens, no problems, then life is great. Well, it's marvelous. You're up there bragging about your wonderful life, but it's not really going to engage the audience. You ever heard somebody talk is really successful and they talk about how successful they are? You ever notice those people are really boring and annoying? There's got to be something going wrong. That's the complication. That's the complication. World champion speaker Craig Valentine says, imagine the movie Titanic if the water didn't rise. Gotta have the water rising, gotta have the ship sinking, gotta have the water rising. That drives the story. That's the complication. Without that complication, there's no story, there's no movie, there's no Oscar, there's no song, there's nothing. Nothing there. Complication. Doesn't have to be a big complication. Be just a simple, realistic complication, and then one day, all of a sudden, they decide I just wasn't that good. You know, we heard some people talking about how they were going to phase me out of the project. And I was worried about keeping my job. Complication. That simple thing. Complication. But if you have a situation of complication, you still need the R-E. R-E, the resolution. Resolution. Now the SCoRe, you got to have a situation, complication, and the resolution. Because just as important as here's the situation, here's the problems going on, is the resolution. Your audience wants to know what happened. You're telling a story with a situation, a complication, and suddenly you come across, well, here's my point. Got to resolve it. And the simplest way to do that is just ask yourself everywhere in the speech, what happens next? What happens next? Because that resolution is going to be what you want your audience to get, what you want your audience to focus on. Situation going on, complication, I do something a special way, and there's this great resolution. I got rags, everything's bad, I got problems, even gets worse and worse and worse. I do something the right way, everything gets resolved. And I'm here to teach you that right way. And it helped me in this, it helped me in that, it helped me in the other thing. Resolution. Make sure your stories have a resolution. So that's it. SCoRe, situation, complication, resolution. You start telling stories like that, and you'll notice you just command the stage. Stories just command the stage. It's a magical thing about them. Gets people's attention, pulls them in. People don't care how long the story is, as long as there's a situation, complication, and a resolution. They are happy with that story. It's a simple process. And makes for a better storytelling existence. It calms you down, it makes it simpler to do speeches. So all you're doing is just standing up there and telling a story, a situation, complication, resolution. Now as you know the secret, go out there and start telling those stories.